Hello, so I'm going to go back over some of the issues with the third project, and look at sort of how to get this thing working. Go ahead and delete that folder. So if you remember back at the very beginning, I had this list of things inside of the Udacity full stack schedule the very first week. I said there's a set of commands when you're working with Python that it's a very good habit just to get into the habit of just running these commands for every single thing you ever do. And the reason why is because they do a lot of nice stuff. One of the things they do is they create a virtual environment. So Python by default installs everything globally. And that seems like it's okay until you keep working on Python projects where you start having Flask, and then you have SQL Alchemy, and then you have scicop2, and eventually your requirements.txt file, whenever people ask, like, how do I get running with your program? What do I need to install? If you just do pip freeze and you output your requirements.txt file, you're going to get 20, 40, 50, 100 dependencies, when in reality you're using maybe 7 or 8 per project. So you want to isolate your dependencies from each other, and you want to make sure that anyone who's installing your software, they're only installing what they need. It just reduces error rate, it reduces file size, it reduces bloat. So it's just a very good habit to get into. Another very good habit is to create a .python-version file, and then to explicitly list what version of Python you're using. And if you run Python-version, you can get that number right there. So that's another very good habit to get into, just so that way there's no confusion about which version of Python is running. All right, so from there, we've used pip freeze, we piped out our requirements.txt file, and then we created what's known as a Python module. If you go to new and you say Python package, that's going to create a directory. The only thing special about a Python package is this __init__.py file, or the __. All this does, it tells Python, these are a set of files that I'm going to be reusing as a package. You can also specify in the init, if you really want to, this is a special file, and you can basically make sure that each time these files are imported, you can have a setup function that always runs or does other work. In general, though, you're going to find most people leave this thing blank except for a handful of special circumstances. Here, we don't have any special sort of setup, so we're just going to leave that blank. Next up, we've got a connection.py file. We import our scicopig2, psychopg, I don't know, psychocopy. Anyway, we import this package, and we define a single function called get_connection. We use the **kwargs, which means that we're going to allow the user to pass in an arbitrary list. Then we create 3 variables from that arbitrary list, and we say kwargs.get. If they pass in the DB name, use that as an argument. Otherwise, just use my default, which is my name. Same thing with my user, and then I have my password. After that, if you're using Python 3.6, you get a kind of nice formatter, which is in front of any string, you can pass in the F, and then you can just use the open and closing curly braces like this, and then pass in the variable name. You'll see whenever I hold down the command key, it's going to know that this is that, and you can use it quite easily. Otherwise, you can go with the old school format, or you can use the older versions of Python 2 and 3's formatter. I like this special new formatter because it's just so much nicer to read than the old version, which was at the end of the string, you would see .format, and then you would pass in your arguments there. So I like this one a lot better, but that's just me. Then we create our cursor and we return it. So this is where all the setup is, and because we have 3 separate requirements here, we want to make sure that we have a single function that's being called to get our connection. So then the first one, I think, is the top articles, I believe. And so this asks to get us the top articles. So from modules, which if you name this a different folder name, that's going to be from whatever that folder name is, then import connection and import formatter. I haven't looked at formatter, but just to go over it very quickly, formatter is another variable argument list. And so the first argument that it accepts is a number. This is going to be an integer, and we set it to default to 25. And then we have a separator that's going to be a string, and by default, it's going to be a series of dashes. So what happens whenever I run that, you can see it right there. There's 25 dashes, and it's just there strictly for making the output just a little bit nicer to read. Format num is something a little more complicated, not too much, but basically what that one does is it just sets a comma after each of the 1,000, millions, etc. places. And that's just to make these strings get formatted a little bit nicer for the total views in all these different areas. All right, so we have a top articles. In order to get this, we select count of log.path. So this makes sure that if the log.path was null, it wouldn't select that. In this case, I don't think there are any null paths, but this is just a precaution. So that way it makes sure you get the correct total views. Then we get the slug, we get the title, we get the name, and we get it from 3 separate places: log, articles, and authors, where the log.path does not equal the blank slash, that's the home page. And the articles.slug equals the substring of log. And then we get the length of /article /+1. You kind of have 2 choices here. The first one is to do what I did, which is to use the substring. The other way you can do it is in the log path, you can actually add this little thing in front of the article, and then that'll make the slug match the article. Either which way is fine. You can either subtract from the path or you can add to the slug. Either one works. And the articles.author equals the authors.id. Now here I'm using the from. You could also use the join, at least for the articles.author on the author's ID. Using a where or using a join, they're pretty much equivalent in this case. Then, because we're using Postgres, we need to group these things. So we're going to group the article, slug, title, and name. That's because Postgres prevents a SQL error, a logical error, of trying to select atomic data in a aggregate function. So count is going to aggregate all this data. Group by is going to group them into separate subcategories. And then we return that connection. So the first one strictly deals with data access. So this is going to get all the data, but it's not going to actually format it in any way, shape, or form. To do the formatting, first we print top articles with the colon, and there we go. That gives us this. Then we have our string repeater here. If I wanted to make this one a little different, for example, I could do something like that. If I rerun this, you now see that I get those stars, but only for this particular one because it's still going to be using the default for the other ones. So that's why we give it the variable list of arguments right there. Next, the get top articles is going to return the connection. If the execute statement is successful, connection is going to be what's known as an iterator. So we're going to say for each item in this iterator, we print out the total views for the article, and then we stringify item 2. And item 2 in this is 0, 1, 2, so that's the title. So for the article with the title, for the author's name, that's number 3 right there. On the page, that's the slug, and then we format that number, and we add it together. And then we repeat our separator after it's through running through that loop. So this here is going to print out the data, and this function here is going to display the data, and this one here is the actual query. And we're putting them all inside of their own little modules folder because we want to separate things that are being used for the purpose of sort of doing work, and then something that's actually going to be the final output of all the work that it's doing. So we want to group together our functions and methods separate from where we're actually using our functions and methods. And we're going to see this again in Flask, that there's generally going to be multiple folders, each with their own responsibility. Calling this modules is kind of because there's different files that are doing different things, and you could name this to be a little more descriptive, and you could put connection and formatter, for example, in their own folder because they do something different than the articles authors. These are basically queries right here. So if I was going to name those, it would be modules queries, and then these ones here may be modules utilities because that's all they are. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, but that's just something to think about whenever you program. So those are our top articles. Then we got our top authors. This is the exact same thing, almost the exact same query. Only thing we're doing different really is counting the authors.id instead of the log.path. Other than that, most of this looks absolutely identical. Then, as before, we iterate over it. And since we're only retrieving 2 things for this one, there's not as much to actually print out. Then finally, the most convoluted or complex, there are like 30 different ways to write this query. This is how I happen to do it. But basically, we use first a subquery selector, and that's this with expression. That tells Postgres, run this query first. And we're going to call this thing T. You could call this anything you wanted. It could be total, or it could be something else. Some students created different views, and then they selected from one set of views, and then with an aggregate query like this, and they selected from another set of views. Either which one works. I told you my preference is to create a queries folder, and then to name whatever the queries are inside of a model, which you'll see that inside of Flask. And then instead of having to use a view, I have one central location that acts as a data accessor, and whatever the query is that I need to run is held inside that model. So, for example, if I wanted to rerun this instead of creating a view, I would just say get errors per day. And if later on I found out that this was a less efficient query, I would change it in that one model, and then it would always be okay. Postgres does make creating views very easy, so it's not too big of a deal if you prefer to do it that way. But it's just sort of an advanced trick because I've been doing this a while. And whenever you have problems, it's generally the database. It's the slowest thing on any system. Being able to diagnose database problems is a pretty big deal. But anyway, this runs the subquery selector with, that grabs all this data, calls it T. Then we concatenate t.failures with the %sign as failure. Then we run toChar on t.failure. And then we group those 2 things that we select. And then we use the halving expression, which is an aggregate selector, and we say where there are more than 1 failures. So anytime the total of all this multiplication, whenever that is greater than 1, we're going to use it. For the way some of you guys are doing this, you're going to have to use a lot of casting. So the log.status thing, that's going to be an integer by default. So you notice that I'm multiplying it by 100.0. That's one way of trying to get Postgres to cast one of the variable types as a floating point integer or as a decimal. And that's what I use right here. But by default, these are going to be integers, and the remainder of any integer is going to be 0, always. So if you don't have it cast to a float, then you're always going to end up with 0 no matter what you do, even if you try multiplying by 100. So casting to decimal right here and casting this is 100.0. Those are 2 things to try to make sure that it always gives me a floating point number and not an integer. Return that for each over it, same difference. And then hopefully whenever we run it, we can see what happens. So just to run it once more. First, we get our total articles, then we get our total authors, and then we get our errors per day. You will have to change some of this stuff. I didn't give you the answers completely scot-free. So some stuff you are going to have to make sure you work with. The get ignore that I have going on right here, you can see that PyCharm's get ignore is probably overkill because it's giving you literally like every single plugin in the world. But if you can get it generated for free, it's pretty nice. Otherwise, really all you're probably going to need is something like no.pyc files and know a few other things. Anyway, and this Python version, I actually like that. So here, not Python version, and that's going to make it kick up right there. Let's go to our terminal. Oh, it's hidden. We'll say get status. You can see here's all the stuff that I modified. One quick thing is that I always use Flake 8 and not Pep 8. They are the same thing. Very minor differences. The reason why I like the Flake 8 protocol, let me do that. So you see here I now have a violation of Python's formatting. If I use Pep 8 like that, you're going to see that it says that you need to specify an input. Now watch it Flake 8. There we go. Flake 8 is actually smart enough to recursively go through the files and folders and then to tell me, hey, you have an error inside one of these folders, so I don't need to specify the exact path. I think with Pep 8 I can do it like maybe this. Let me actually add that error back in. Nope, it's not that smart. #/#/pound.py. There we go. So that's the equivalent pep8 command. I don't like typing all that stuff, so I like flake8 just a little bit better for those particular purposes. That's why I use that. Inside of here, you'll see it. Flake8 has pep8 as part of it, so it's the exact same thing, just a little bit nicer, a couple of extra features that help out. Anyway, git commit am, modified structure a bit, push it up, and then it's good to go. So just make sure that you're doing all this stuff. You don't necessarily have to split it up into modules. You don't necessarily have to create the _score and init.py. You don't have to do all that stuff. But you do need to make sure that you understand what these queries are doing and working through them. You do need to make sure that you understand how to write a README file. I know that there is a terrible how to create a README file on Udacity. It's quite corny, the one with the dude with the chef. I hope they update that at some point. Get what's his name, Quentin, or whoever the instructor is right now, get him or someone else to do it. Just don't get that corny stuff again. Anywho, that's the overall idea. And then finally, from modules import, you're also going to need to make sure that you have this. Strangely enough, this is a requirement for the project. I think it's kind of silly because they don't give out a computer, and Windows, Linux, all these other ones have different ways of doing this. But this is what's known as the hash bang or shebang. So hash, that's the pound symbol, and then bang, that's what number name for the question mark. So shebang is the hash and then the bang. This tells it whenever you run user ben env python. You'll see my particular version is Python 3.6.1. The use case for that is, to me, obscure and kind of stupid to act as if it's a common use case. But you'll notice that we've been running this by saying Python and then saying queryrunner.py, and we're going to see that works perfectly fine. Another way you can run this is you can run this purely from the shell, which would be /. So this is one of the cases where you actually need to have that. And then that'll run these commands. Unfortunately, that usually fails by default. And you're going to have to run chmod, which will change the permissions for it. And basically, you're going to have to say that the user has read, write, and execute, the group has read, write, and execute, and others have read and execute permissions on everything within here. You'll note if you run ls-lha, you notice that suddenly we get this super funky highlighting right here. And that's just because now that everything's executable, this color is kind of meant to warn you that it's live. People can actually execute this. I don't know why it acts like that's such a huge deal, because yeah, I want that. So I can do that and it'll work just fine. If I change those permissions, I'll just let it execute and then I'll show you what happens. All right, there we go. Now we've reset it. I'll have to remember to exit out all the other garbage I just put in there. But here you'll notice that there's no X on that ls-lha. This is a Mac and Linux only thing. If you're on Windows, you don't have this sort of issue. But if now I try running the exact same command /queryrunner, you'll notice I get a permission denied thing, and that's because it's not executable. And to make it executable, I need to ensure that everything has this little X on it. So the lowercase x, not the uppercase x, I run the ls-lha. I get this red highlighting instead of this plain black highlighting, and then now I can run it. So it's one of those obscure things that Udacity portfolios are kind of obsessed about that annoys me, because this is a not very common use case where you're running Python commands from your ZSH shell or your bash shell, but they act like it's very important, so just make sure you do that. You will notice there's a slight formatting issue on this thing. This is actually some sort of Postgres problem, because if I run the raw query even without any Python formatting, it looks exactly like that. So I don't know quite what's up, but it seems to be localized to my system only. Even if not, that is still a perfectly valid way of doing things. So anyway, we looked at the queries. You can go check us out on Git. We looked at some of the print. We looked at the formatters. We looked at setting up Python version. We looked at all sorts of great stuff.